Electricast. Welcome to Her Extraordinary Life by Design, where we celebrate women who are shaping their lives one extraordinary day at a time. I'm your host, Leslie Gaudette, self-care coach for women who are ready to make self-care a priority to support them in life and business. Every week, I'll be speaking with inspiring women from various walks of life who will share their personal journeys and will discover how they have fearlessly carved their own paths as business owners, passionately pursuing their dreams and creating a meaningful impact on their communities. So let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to Her Extraordinary Life by Design podcast. I'm your host, Leslie Gaudette, and I want to talk about something today that I think a lot of women are doing and what we're not talking about. I know that it's not because they don't know that they're doing it, but because admitting that they don't feel safe enough to show up as themselves, that they're afraid of being judged, criticized, or seen as less than, will require a level of honesty that the thing itself won't allow. And I'm going to say this and know that I am saying this with love. I truly am. But what you're doing is hiding, not from the world, but from yourself. And you've gotten so good at it that it doesn't even feel like hiding anymore. It just feels like a normal way of being, like you're being careful, like you're being smart about what you put out there on social media. But here's what I see that's actually happening. You have something real to say, something that comes from actual lived experience, something raw and real and true, the kind that can only come from someone who's actually been in the room, lived the experience, and felt what it feels like from the inside. And you won't say what you're thinking, experiencing, living, or how you feel, at least not under your own name, not with your own face attached to it, and not even in a space where the people who know you professionally could connect it back to you. You won't do that unless you use the mask, the anonymous filter mask. So instead of being yourself, being authentic and true to who you are, and sharing from that vulnerable place, you put on the filter, the anonymous one, the one that lets you say the true thing, what you truly think and feel, without paying the price of being the one who said it out loud. And behind that filter, you finally exhale and you say what you actually think. And you ask the question you've been sitting with for months. And you admit the thing that's been true for longer than you're comfortable saying out loud. And when people respond and they say, yes, exactly, thank you for saying this, for a moment you feel what it feels like to be heard as yourself, except that nobody knows that it's you. And I want to stop there because that moment where you felt genuinely heard, but you had to hide who you were to feel it, that's not just a social media habit. That's a signal, one that's been trying to tell you something for a long time. And I understand why the filter exists. I truly do. Because on the one hand, if you're building a business, your reputation is your brand, right? And one honest post that lands wrong and you're not just embarrassed, but in your mind, you believe that one wrong post will potentially be watching clients walk out the door. At least that's what it feels like. And then on the other side of this, if you're navigating a professional environment, then your reputation is your career, which means that one vulnerable moment seen by the wrong person, and suddenly you're not the polished, capable woman they thought you were. So you protect yourself. But here's something I want you to think about. What is that protection actually doing for you? Not your reach, not your influence, not your career or business, but what is it doing for you as a human, as a woman who's trying to be seen and heard and understood, if the world that you're navigating hasn't always made it safe to be all three at the same time? You see, when the mask becomes your default, and the less you show up as yourself, the less you know who that person actually is, who you actually are. Your own voice starts to feel unfamiliar. Your own perspective starts to feel uncertain. And you start second guessing what you want to say or how you want to say it so that when you do say it, it doesn't ruffle any feathers, which is something that I've been noticing when I see women posting about how they're struggling, but then ending their posts telling everyone else that they're valued. And that trust that you used to have in yourself, in your right to show up, to speak up and be seen as who you actually are, that disappears. Because the moment you put on the mask and it becomes your default and you've forgotten what it feels like to stand there as yourself, then the mask stops being something you wear and it starts being something you've become. And that's what I want to talk about today. Not the filter itself, but what the filter does to you when you continuously wear it like it's part of who you are. So let me paint a picture for you. Two women, neither of them is a specific person, but I'd be willing to bet that one of them, maybe both of them, is going to feel very familiar. You might even recognize yourself in one of them, or you might even recognize yourself in both of them. So let's talk about the first woman who built a business. Not overnight, not without sacrifice, and not without years of showing up, earning credibility, building a reputation that now precedes her in every room she walks into. She's her brand, and she knows it, which means that every word she puts into the world gets filtered through a very specific question before it ever makes it out. Will this cost me something I can't afford to lose? So that when she sits down to post something, something real, something that came from an actual experience rather than a content calendar, she types it out, she reads it back, and then something tight because the post's honest, but it's too honest because it shows the part of her that doesn't have it figured out, the part that's frustrated, the part that has a question that she's embarrassed to not already know the answer to, the part that's navigating something hard and would genuinely benefit from hearing that someone else has been there too. And she knows absolutely, without a doubt, that her audience needs to hear exactly that version of her, that the women she's trying to reach aren't looking for another perfectly packaged version of someone who has it all figured out. She knows that real connection happens in the real moments, not the curated ones, right? And she knows all of this. But when she goes to hit post, instead of posting as herself, she switches her name out for the filter. No name, no face, no way to connect back to her business, her brand, her carefully constructed professional identity. And because of the filter, she feels safe to post how she really feels. Finally, feeling safe to just be a woman who doesn't have all the answers without it costing her everything she's built. And when people respond, when they say, yes, exactly, thank you for saying this, I needed to hear this today, it makes her feel good. It makes her feel heard, except that nobody knows that it's her. And then she goes on with her day. She goes back to the polished version of herself and she starts preparing for the next carefully considered post or piece of content where it's safe enough to exist under her actual name because it doesn't ask anyone to see her as anything other than the professional she's spent years becoming. Now, let me tell you about the second woman. Instead of a business, she built a career, decade by decade, room by room, earning the kind of credibility that only comes from showing up consistently, performing excellently, and never, ever letting anyone see what it actually costs her. She's capable, she's respected, she's the woman people go to when something needs to get done, and she has learned, not from a handbook, not from a mentor, but from watching and absorbing and in paying very close attention, she has learned exactly what is and what isn't acceptable to say in the environments that she navigates. She learned it the first time she said something too honest in a meeting and she watched the room shift. She learned from watching a colleague share something vulnerable and then saw how that vulnerability followed her. She learned in the subtle ways that professional environments teach women to be less emotional, less complicated, less human, in exchange for being taken seriously. And so she started doing the work of the room before she even got there, pre-editing, pre-managing, and deciding in advance what was safe to bring and what needed to stay hidden. Not because she's inauthentic, but because she understands the game she's playing and what the stakes are if she plays it wrong. And so now when she joins communities, professional groups, industry forums, spaces full of people who do what she does and navigate what she navigates, she reads, she absorbs, she has opinions forming that she would never say out loud because her colleagues are there, because leadership might see it, because one wrong post, one moment of being too real, too raw, or too honest about what it's actually like could undo years of carefully maintained professional credibility. So she posts anonymously, and the honest version of her, the one with something real to say, stays behind the filter where it's safe. Two women, one built a brand, one built a career. Different stakes, different fears, different reasons for reaching for the mask, but the same moment. The moment when something true surfaces, something worth saying, something that needs to be said, and the filter goes on. Not because they don't have a voice, but because the world that they're operating in has made it very clear, directly or indirectly, that using it fully has a price they're not willing to pay. And here's what I want you to sit with, because this is where the story stops being about two random women and it starts being about you. Think about the last time you had something real to say, something that would have required you to show up as yourself, fully, honestly, without the filter, in a space where that felt genuinely risky. What did you do with it? Did you say it or did you fold it away? Or did you say it, but only when nobody knew it was you? And if you folded it away, or if the filter went on and the anonymous name came out instead of your own, I want you to notice something about that. Not about the post, but about the moment after, the moment when you put the mask away and you went back to being the version of yourself that feels safe to show publicly. What did that feel like? Because maybe the mask was a form of protection, but it could also feel like loss, the kind you've gotten so used to that you stopped registering it as loss at all, but a loss nonetheless of something that was yours to say, that you gave to a name that wasn't yours because your name didn't feel safe enough to carry it. And if any of this sounds familiar and you recognize yourself either in the entrepreneur protecting her brand or the professional protecting her career, or maybe even both of them, stay with me because the anonymous filter isn't really about social media. It's not about personal branding or visibility strategy or how to show up more authentically online. It goes so much deeper than that. And so that's why today, the first thing I want to look at is why high achieving women, whether they're building something of their own or they're navigating someone else's environment, they don't feel safe speaking their truth in the spaces they're actually in. And I want to be clear about something before we get there, because this isn't about confidence or courage or needing to be braver or bolder or more willing to be vulnerable, because framing it that way puts the problem on you. And the problem isn't you. The problem is what you've learned about what happens when you show up too honestly in spaces that rewarded your performance, but never actually welcomed your presence. So that's the first thing I want to talk about. And then I want to go somewhere that I think is going to land a little bit differently than you're expecting, because most conversations about the anonymous filter focus on what it costs you externally, which is your reach, your visibility, your ability to connect with the people who need to find you. And while that's all real, I want to talk about something else that lives much closer to home than any of that. Because what I believe the anonymous filter is actually doing is that it's affecting your relationship with your voice, your ability to trust yourself to speak, to trust the version of you that existed before the mask became the default. Because I think that's the cost that gets overlooked. When the filter, as one of my guests on my podcast for this month talks about, and you'll hear her episode later this month, Dr. Mikkel Dent, she said something that stuck with me, which I believe. She said, and I quote, masking is not always bad. Sometimes it's protection. Sometimes it's needed. It becomes a problem, though, when we get so caught up in the mask that one, we forget that we're wearing the mask, or two, we forget to take it off and we begin suffocating. And that's something that really deserves a lot of attention and one that I definitely am going to lean into. So that's the second lens. And then finally, I want to talk about something that a lot of conversations about this topic skip entirely because they jump straight to here's how you show up more authentically. Here's how you overcome the fear. Here's how you start posting without the filter. And I'm not going there, not today, because before any of that becomes possible, something else has to happen first, something internal, something that has nothing to do with what you post or how often or in what spaces you're in. And I want to name what that something actually is, because until you can see it clearly, that gap between who you are anonymously and who you show up as publicly, it's not going to close. Not in any way that actually lasts unless you first understand what built the gap in the first place. And so that's the third and final thing we'll cover today. So that's where we're going. I'm not going to be talking about social media and visibility. I'm actually going to be leaning into the conversation under the visibility piece, the one about what it's actually costing you to keep the most powerful version of yourself hidden behind a name that isn't yours. So let's talk about the pattern that's driving the filter, because it isn't what most people think it is. It isn't about lacking confidence. It's not about being afraid of your own voice. And it's simply about professional consequences, although those are real. It's about what you've witnessed, what you've seen happen to other women who showed up as themselves in spaces they believed were safe, only to find out they weren't. Because you've seen the vulnerable post get met with cruelty instead of compassion. You've watched someone share something real and honest, something that took real courage to say, and then you watch them get torn apart in the comments by people who hid behind their own keyboards to say things they would never say to someone's face. You've watched reputations get damaged, not because someone said the wrong thing, but because they said a true thing to the wrong audience. And you filed all of that away as evidence, real evidence from real situations that you witnessed with your own eyes. And so the anonymous filter became the most logical response to that evidence, a way to say the true thing without becoming a target for saying it, a way to be real without paying the price that being real sometimes costs in spaces that aren't actually safe. Because here's what the world you're navigating actually looks like. It's not a theoretical fear. It's not an irrational hesitation. It's a world where you've seen with your very own eyes what happens when women show up as themselves in spaces that were never built to hold them safely, where the comments section can become a courtroom, where vulnerability gets weaponized, where someone who seemed supportive turns out to be performing support while privately judging, and where you genuinely can't tell from a name and a static picture who's actually in your corner and who's waiting for you to say the wrong thing. And so the anonymous filter isn't weakness, it's wisdom born from witnessing because you learned from what you saw happen to other women and you made a completely rational decision to protect yourself from the same fate. And here's the thing about that decision it works. That's why you keep using it. It keeps you safe from the cruelty. It lets you exhale. It lets you finally be heard without being exposed behind a filter that you can ask the question you've been sitting with for months, where you can admit the thing that's been true for longer than you've been comfortable saying out loud, and you can finally be heard. Except again, nobody knows that it's you. And I'm not here to tell you the price isn't real because it is real. I know it. I understand it. I understand that sometimes people can be cruel and judgmental, and that there's many women who've been burned for showing up too honestly in spaces that weren't ready for their truth. I've seen that happen. I'm not dismissing any of it. But here's what I want you to sit with today, because this is where I believe the pattern becomes something worth examining. You see, what the filter does over time with repetition, with enough uses that it becomes the default, is that it confirms something. It starts to confirm that you're only safe when you're hidden. And a woman who only feels safe when she's hidden eventually stops knowing how to be seen. That's the pattern at the center of this. That's what I'm talking about. Not I can't afford to say what I actually think, but I only feel safe when nobody knows it's me. And that, however understandable, however well earned from real evidence in a world that genuinely isn't always kind, has been doing something that you never signed up for. Because the filter that was supposed to protect your voice has been slowly silencing it instead. The tragedy isn't that you made that decision. The tragedy is what that decision has been doing to you over time. Because what started as protection has become something else, something that you didn't choose and that you didn't see coming. A slow separation from the version of you that existed before the filter became the only way you felt safe enough to speak. Until you're not even sure anymore whether you're choosing to stay behind the filter or whether the filter has become the only version of you that you still know how to be. And when the anonymous name starts to feel safer than your own, when reaching for the filter becomes as automatic as breathing, that has a cost. Because even though you're still showing up, you're still maintaining the image that took years to build. From the outside looking in, everything looks exactly the way it's supposed to look. But what's happening underneath that picture, and I want you to stay with me on this, because I feel like this is the part that doesn't get named. Because naming it would require someone to show up as themselves and say the true thing. And we've already established how that tends to go, right? What I believe is that the first cost lives in what happens to your relationship with your own name, not your reputation, your name, the one you were given, the one you've built something under, the one that used to feel like yours to use freely. And I want you to think about what I just said about your name. I want you to think about what it feels like now to attach your name to something, something real, something honest, something that didn't go through the safety check first. When you imagine posting something vulnerable, something true with your actual name on it in a space where your professional peers could see it, do you feel that tightening? Is there a quick scan of who might be watching? Is there a voice in the back of your head that surfaces immediately and starts running through worst case scenarios before you even finish the thought? Because that response, that automatic, almost involuntary tightening, that's the cost. Not because you're weak, but because you've been paying attention and you've seen what happens in those spaces. You've watched women show up honestly and get met with something that looked nothing like the support they deserved. You've watched the comment section become a place where people say things from behind their screens that they'd never say to someone's face. And then you've watched someone's truth become someone else's ammunition. And your nervous system filed all of it in your memory bank. Every instance, every woman who took a risk and paid a price, every moment that confirmed what you were already beginning to suspect. That being seen as yourself under your own name in spaces where you can't control who's watching isn't always safe. And so that's why the filter goes off. Maybe not as a permanent decision at first, maybe just for now, just until you can figure out which spaces are actually safe and which ones are performing safety while doing something else entirely, just until you can tell from a name and a static picture who actually has your back and who's waiting for you to say the wrong thing. Except you never quite figured that out, did you? Because you can't, not with certainty. Not in a world where the same person can post a supportive comment publicly and share your post privately as a cautionary tale. Not in a world where the line between genuine compassion and performed compassion isn't always visible. And so the filter stays on. Past now, past just for now, past the point where it was a choice and into the place where it became the default. And the cost of that, every time your name feels too risky to attach to your honest thoughts, every time the anonymous version gets to say the true thing while your actual name gets the safe version, something is being confirmed that your name, your actual identity, your real face, your genuine self is something that needs to be protected from the spaces that you're in. That the real you is a liability in the very environments you've been building a professional life inside of. And a woman who's confirmed often enough that her real self is a liability in her own professional world, she starts to believe it as a reflex, as the automatic reach for the filter that happens before she's even decided to reach for it. And then there's a second cost, which is even harder to name because it's not about what you stop saying, it's about what you stop knowing and believing about yourself. There's a particular kind of disorientation that comes from living behind a filter for long enough, a growing uncertainty about what you actually think, what you actually believe, what the unfiltered version of your perspective even sounds like anymore. Because here's what chronic filtering can do over time. It doesn't just change what you say, it changes what surfaces first before you even get to the decision of whether to post something or not. Before you even get to the filter, your own mind starts doing the work of the filter for you, pre-editing, pre-managing, running everything through the safety check before it even makes it to the surface as a fully formed thought, until the unfiltered version stops surfacing at all. Not because it doesn't exist, but because it learned a long time ago that it wasn't going to make it out anyway. And that's when the disorientation sets in. When you sit down to say something true and you realize you're not entirely sure what true sounds like in your own voice anymore. When someone asks what you think and you feel yourself reaching for the acceptable answer before you even check in with the actual one. When you look at the women around you who seem to speak without that constant internal negotiation and you can't remember the last time you did that. And the most disorienting part of it all is that you feel like a stranger to yourself. Like the woman who shows up with your name on her is someone you've been performing for so long that you've lost the thread back to who she actually is underneath the performance. But that's not who you are. It's who you became when the world made it too costly to be who you actually are. And those are two very different things, even if right now they're starting to feel like the same thing. And that cost, the accumulated weight of a voice that's been managed instead of used, of a self that's been curated instead of lived, at some point, the weight of carrying it becomes harder than the fear of what might happen if you put it down. So I want to ask you something, and I don't want you to answer it right away. I just want you to sit with it. I want you to think about what it would be like if you let yourself actually follow a worst case scenario thought all the way through, not to scare yourself, but to finally see it clearly, to actually reflect on how you think. Like when you picture a worst case scenario moment, one that's been driving the filter, what does it actually look like? What does it actually feel like? Like if you said the honest thing under your own name, if you posted the real version of you instead of the filtered one, what do you believe would happen? Who would see it? What would they think? What would it cost you? Because I want to suggest something that might be uncomfortable to consider. You see, I believe that the fear lives in the gap between the moment of speaking and the imagined consequence. And in that gap, the imagined sequence has had years to grow into something enormous, right? Something career ending, something brand destroying, something that justifies every filtered post, every deleted draft, every anonymous name. But then I also want you to consider a what if, meaning when you actually follow the thought all the way through a what's the worst case scenario, when you name the specific person who would see it and the specific thing they would think and the specific consequence that would follow, what if instead of everything unraveling the way you think it will, what if instead of the judgment, the fallout, the professional consequences you've been bracing for, what if what actually happened was simply that someone nodded, that someone said, yeah, me too, that someone felt less alone because you said the true thing? And what if the consequence you've been imagining, the one that's been living in the gap between speaking and the feared outcome, what if it turned out to be far smaller than the version your fear has been building? And listen, that's not me telling you that the fear isn't real. I know it's real. The environments that created it are real. The women who got burned for speaking too freely in professional spaces, that's all real. The client maybe who decided not to work with someone because of a post that felt too vulnerable That's probably happened somewhere to someone. And I'm not dismissing any of it. What I'm trying to say is that the fear has been doing a job that's much bigger than the actual risk it's protecting you from. And it's been doing that job for so long that you've stopped questioning whether the protection is still proportionate to the threat. Because here's what else has been happening as well. The filter hasn't just been keeping the consequences out, it's been keeping you locked in a version of yourself that gets smaller and smaller every time the filter goes on, in a professional identity that's becoming harder and harder for you to inhabit fully because it was built around what's safe rather than what's true. In a relationship with your own voice that's gotten so strained that speaking as yourself, fully, honestly, under your own name, now requires a level of effort that it never used to. And at some point, when the weight of it finally becomes undeniable, the question of is the filter actually protecting me or has it become the thing that's costing me the most starts to surface. That question, I've found that, when you hit that moment of, is this really truly happening? Is this really true? This is not coming as an accusation, but as a reckoning, right? The question when you hit that point where it's like you hit the wall, like your back's against the wall, it's not an accusation, it's a reckoning. And when you can sit with that question and not filing it away the way you filed away every other uncomfortable truth, that is where things can start to shift. Because when you allow yourself to sit with the question, it separates the filter from the identity. And it reminds you that the filter is a choice, one that's been made in environments that genuinely weren't safe. But it's a choice nonetheless. And it doesn't have to be permanent. It's a pattern that was learned. And patterns that were learned can be examined. And when you see them clearly enough, when you can finally name what built them and what they've been costing you, they begin to lose their grip. And listen, examining it doesn't mean abandoning the safety net overnight. It doesn't mean throwing caution away or pretending that professional context doesn't matter or deciding that every thought deserves a public platform. That's not what this is about. What this is about is noticing for the first time with clear eyes the difference between genuine discernment and fear based self erasure because they feel similar from the inside. Both of them result in not saying the thing. Both of them feel like a reasonable response to a real risk, but they come from completely different places. Because genuine discernment says saying this particular thing in this particular space at this particular time isn't mine to say publicly. And it makes that call from a place of groundedness rather than fear. But fear based self erasure says nothing's safe. No version of me is safe. The only way to protect what I built is to keep the real version of me hidden indefinitely. And the difference between choosing not to share something and believing you're not safe to share anything, that difference is everything. That difference, when you notice it, that can make all the difference because one of them's a boundary, right? But the other's a cage. And a lot of women have been living inside the cage for so long that they started calling it discernment. And here's what I want you to notice about the cage. It was built from moments where being too honest had consequences. It was constructed piece by piece from evidence that seemed to confirm the same conclusion every time, that it's not safe to be fully yourself here. Like it's not safe to be fully myself in this environment. But here's what I want you to understand about cages built from old evidence. The world changes, right? Spaces change, and sometimes the people in them change too. Sometimes the evidence that built the cage is no longer as current as it feels. And the version of you that needed the cage as desperately as you once did has grown in ways that the cage hasn't accounted for. And when you start to see that, when you start to notice that the filter was built for a version of your circumstances that may no longer be entirely accurate, I like to think of it this way. If you allow yourself to notice that the filter was built for a different version of circumstances that may no longer be entirely accurate, what would happen if you said the true thing the next time you go to post as yourself, the true you? Not recklessly or without thought, but honestly. Because I believe that that's where you'll find the gap between who you are and who you allow yourself to be, and that gap will start to narrow. Not because the fear disappears, but because you stop letting the fear make decisions that belong to you. And please understand, I'm not here to tell you to take the filter off completely. I'm not here to tell you that the world is safe enough now and that vulnerability always gets met with compassion, because a lot of the times it doesn't. Sometimes the filter is still the wisest choice. Sometimes it's the only way to speak your truth in a world where you can't always hold people accountable for what they say from behind a name and a static picture. And that's okay. The filter isn't the enemy. And as I said, as one of my guest experts on the show, Dr. Mikkel Dent, in her episode that she's going to be sharing later this month, this stayed with me when she said that masking isn't always bad. Sometimes it's protection, sometimes it's needed. And it only becomes a problem when we get so caught up in the mask that we forget we're wearing it or when we forget to take it off. And that's what I want you to sit with. Not whether the filter is right or wrong, but whether you still know it's there, whether you're choosing it consciously in specific spaces for specific reasons, or whether it's been choosing for you for so long, you've stopped noticing the difference. Because a filter you choose with clear eyes is discernment. But a filter that's become your default without your consent, that's the one worth taking a second look at. So I have some more questions for you that I want you to think about as you carry on with the rest of your day. Do you know when you're wearing the filter? Not whether you use it. We've already established that sometimes you do and that sometimes it's the right call. But do you know in the moment, consciously with clear eyes, when it goes on? Or has it become so automatic that it just is? Because there's a difference between choosing the filter and living inside it without realizing you're there. Because one's a decision and the other is where masking becomes a problem, where you forget that you're wearing the mask when the protection becomes the default so completely that you've stopped registering it as protection at all and you've started registering it as just you. So I want you to think about the last time you posted something online or the last time you were in a professional community and you chose not to say something under your own name. And when you were in those spaces, did you know in that moment that you were making a choice or did it happen before you even got to choose? And then finally, do you know what it would feel like to take off that mask? Not in every space, not all at once, but somewhere in a space that feels genuinely safe enough to be yourself with one person or a group of people that you trust. Do you know what it would feel like to show up as yourself, like fully, honestly, under your own name and say the true thing? Because I think some of you listening know exactly what that feels like, right? You felt it behind the filter in the moment when you posted something anonymously and people said, "Yes, exactly. Thank you for saying this. This resonated so much. I so needed to hear this today." And you felt heard in a way that the polished version of you almost never gets to feel. That's the feeling I'm talking about. That specific quality of being genuinely heard as yourself. That's what's on the other side of the filter. Not guaranteed safety, not a world where no one will ever be unkind, but the experience of being known, like really known as yourself. And you deserve to know what that feels like under your own name in a space that was actually built to hold it. You see, I believe the anonymous filter exists because somewhere in a professional community, in an industry space, in a room full of peers, a woman learned that showing up as herself had a price. Her reputation, her credibility, the professional identity she spent years building. And that cost of being too real, too raw, too honest in the wrong space was the one she wasn't willing to pay. And so she adapted. But here's what adapting does. A woman who has real things to say but doesn't feel safe to say them, who's present in the spaces she's part of, but only as a managed version of herself, the one that's been edited and filtered before it's allowed to exist publicly, who's been carrying the weight of her own unspoken truth for so long. What happens is she stopped noticing how heavy it actually is. And I see this every single day, especially in the posts that come through anonymously, where women have something vulnerable to say, but they only feel safe enough saying it anonymously and communities that were designed for connection but are full of people performing connection rather than actually having it. And the legal profession specifically, where credibility is currency, where being seen as too human can feel like a professional liability, where the filter doesn't just protect a brand but an entire career. This pattern runs deeper than almost anywhere else I've seen it. And what I want to say to the high achieving woman, to women in professional spaces, to women in law who've been navigating all of this, to the woman who posts anonymously because her colleagues are in the same communities, to the one who has questions she'd never ask under her own name, to the woman who has been performing certainty she doesn't always have in spaces that have never made it safe to admit otherwise. You're not alone in this, and you deserve somewhere that's actually built for what you're actually carrying, which is exactly why I've been behind the scenes building something that I think will make a difference. Because what I've realized is that it's not about social media or personal branding or how we show up more authentically online. It's about what happens to a woman's relationship with her own voice when the environment she operates in has never once created space for her to speak her truth without the filter on. When every community she's part of is also full of people she has to manage her reputation with. When the only place she can finally exhale and say what she actually thinks is behind a name that isn't her own. And what I've come to understand about why the anonymous filter exists in the first place is that it's not that women don't want to speak, it's that they've never had a space that was actually built to make it safe to do so. A space where you don't have to decide before you speak whether what you're about to say is safe enough, where your honest question isn't a liability, where the filter doesn't have to come on because the space itself was designed so that it doesn't have to. And so I've been working on something I think solves that problem. Not by asking you to be braver, not by telling you that the world is safe enough now and that vulnerability always gets met with compassion, but a space that was designed with your safety in mind. So imagine a monthly virtual gathering, no faces, no names, no titles. All of that gets left at the door, just voices, where you register with your real name and email on the back end so that there's accountability. Only I will know who you are. But when you show up to the gathering, nobody sees your face. They don't know your name or your role or your company or business environment or how many years you've been building the reputation you've been protecting. What's left is just a human experience of being a woman who has things she's never felt safe enough to say out loud. And when I say when you come with no name, no face, and no title, I've got something that I'm doing as a workaround for that. It's going to be fun. It's going to make it enjoyable. That's going to make it feel like you can exhale, you can be yourself. And I have an idea that I'm working on for that specific way of showing up in that virtual meeting with no name, with no face, and no title. And I'll share that with those of you who decide to come in and join me on these virtual events. And as I've been saying, I've been building this, I've been saying that I've been building something for women in law. But frankly, as I've been sitting with this over the past few weeks, I have realized that we're all hurting, right? We're all using the filter to feel safe enough so that we can feel seen and heard and hopefully understood without being judged or criticized or attacked in the comments, right? And so that's why I want to create that room, that specific kind of room where the anonymous filter stops being necessary. Yes, again, I said no names, no faces, no titles, because the space itself is going to be built to be what the filter was always trying to create. And as I said, I'm working on that because the space itself is built to be what the filter was always trying to create: safety without the professional consequences, without the judgment from people who know your name and your face and your reputation, without wondering whether the person behind the supportive comment is actually in your corner or they're just performing support while privately thinking something else entirely. Just voices and the beginning of what it can feel like to finally speak as yourself. And as I said, I have a fun workaround for that that I think will make the experience really enjoyable, light, and just make you feel like, finally, I can be me. Okay. Because what I truly believe is when you can take the filter off and you can truly be yourself, that only works if it's actually designed with your experience in mind. And that's why I have this idea that I really truly feel is the answer to the filter itself. It's not a space that's going to ask you to perform openness, but it's going to be a space where showing up as you, as the real you, is the only thing that's required, just your authentic voice. So here's what I want to know. If I held a monthly gathering on Zoom, no faces, no names, and no titles, just voices and honest conversation about what it feels like to be a woman navigating your world, would you come? I want you to send me an email. You'll find it in the show notes. Just say yes to the gathering, and that'll let me know that you're interested, and I'll complete the build out. Again, you don't have to be in the legal profession, but if this conversation landed somewhere real for you, I want to hear from you. Because the anonymous filter doesn't just belong to one community, it belongs to all of us when we feel like we can't be true to who we are. It belongs to every woman who's learned that speaking her truth in professional spaces has an expensive price that she's unwilling to pay. And for every woman who wonders, even for a moment, whether there's somewhere you could finally say the true thing, that's what I'm offering. So check the show notes, send me an email, and let's do this together. Now, before you go, I want to say one more something that I think is important for you to remember, especially after everything that we covered today. You've built something real. Don't ever forget that. Whether it's a business, a career, a professional reputation that took years of showing up consistently, performing excellently, and never letting anyone see what it cost you. You built it, and that matters. And the filter that protected you along the way, the one that's kept your most honest thoughts safe from spaces that weren't always safe to receive them, that filter isn't weakness. It was the response of a smart woman in a world that doesn't always reward honesty with the respect it deserves. But here's what I also want you to carry with you after today. What you built was never supposed to be the thing that kept your voice small. It was supposed to be the thing that gave it more reach, more weight, more ability to land in the places it was always meant to go. And somewhere between protecting what you built and hiding who you actually are, the filter has stopped being a tool and it started being a home. And the woman who lives inside her filter long enough, who forgets it's there, who forgets to take it off, who starts to suffocate inside it without realizing that's what's happening, that woman stops knowing the difference between the version of herself that's safe to show up and the version of herself that's actually her. And I want to say something to that woman directly, to you. That's not who you are. That's who you became when the world made it too costly to be who you actually are. The version of you that only comes out anonymously, the one who asks the real questions, who says the true thing, who speaks from the inside of your actual experience rather than the outside of your carefully managed image. She isn't less than the public version. She's more. You're more real, more connected to what the people around you actually need to hear, more powerful than the filtered version will ever be. And you, that version of you, deserves somewhere safe to exist, not behind a name that isn't yours, but as yourself, fully, in a room that was actually built to hold your true self. That's what today was really about. Not the filter itself, but what the filter has been doing to the voice it was supposed to protect. And whether you, the real you, the unfiltered you, the you that has things worth saying, are ready to start asking what it would feel like to finally say them as yourself, I think you are. And I think you deserve a space that makes that possible. And that's what I'm building. Thanks for spending time with me today. I truly appreciate you. Until next time, keep dreaming, keep believing, and keep designing your extraordinary life one day at a time.
Thank you for joining me on Her Extraordinary Life by Design. I hope you've been inspired and empowered by the incredible stories shared on this show. If you enjoyed this episode and the conversations we've had, I would greatly appreciate if you could take a moment to leave a review. Your feedback and support mean the world to me, and it will help others discover the podcast and join our empowering community. Remember to hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Together, we can continue to learn from these amazing women, uncover their extraordinary journeys, and be motivated to create our own lives by design. Thank you again for tuning in. Until next time, stay empowered and keep shaping your extraordinary life one day at a time. Electric